and taking the lead from extension educators throughout the state. So thank you, Dr. Athey. We look forward to your presentation.
All right, well, thank you for that. Can everybody hear me?
Yes.
Excellent. All right, perfect. Yeah, so today I'm going to talk about cucurbit pests. And I'm going to start with just sort of general recommendations on controlling the big cucurbit pests. And then I'm going to spend a fair amount of time on a project I did as a graduate student in Kentucky on cultural control in cucurbit production. And so, of course, for anybody who grows cucurbits, these are the usual suspects. The main pests of cucurbits generally are the spotted and striped cucumber beetles on the left, the squash vine borer on the upper right, and of course, squash bugs down on the lower right. And I just included here, this is a picture of the nymphs. And so I'm going to start with striped and spotted cucumber beetles. And in cucurbit production, generally, insecticide applications are usually required from transplantation to control striped and spotted cucumber beetles. And that is because these pests carry and transmit bacterial wilt, which across the cucurbit growing regions is probably one of the most devastating diseases of cucurbits, especially spread by insects. And it can, in places, lead to an 80% reduction in yield. And of course, there's no cure for this disease. And once a plant is infected, it will eventually succumb. So we spend a lot of time and effort to control these particular pests. And so cucumber beetles overwinter as adults in soil and in crop margins. And they move into the crops in the spring and early summer. And they have 1 to 2 generations per year. And the larvae actually feed on the roots of cucurbits, and they don't really do any significant damage as larvae. The damage is in the adult stage. And I'd also like to point out something else with cucumber beetles is the cucumber beetles here on the left, the striped cucumber beetles, really are only pests of cucurbits specifically. Whereas the spotted cucumber beetle on the right is also a pest of lots of other things, and it's one of the corn rootworms as well. And so that one will move to different crops. And I've included a series of pictures of some of the direct damage you'd expect maybe to see from striped and spotted cucumber beetles. And these guys will feed on the leaves, the stems, the fruit, basically the whole plant. And you can see that, they can cause this damage here in some of these pictures on actual fruit, which could potentially make it a cull and not marketable. So when you're trying to control these and you're scouting, there are certain thresholds for control, and they do vary by the crop you're actually dealing with. So on muskmelon, cucumber, and processing pumpkins, the threshold is about 1 beetle per plant, whereas the threshold for things like watermelon or winter squashes or non-processing pumpkins is 5 beetles per plant. And this is primarily because things like melon, cucumbers, they are much more susceptible to bacterial wilt. So you have to be more careful with those with the cucumber beetles. And you can use yellow sticky traps to monitor for cucumber beetles and detect mass emergences. And so this is an easy way for you to do your scouting and monitoring. Now, additionally, it is important to till crops after harvest to destroy the overwintering beetles. The use of row covers for insect exclusion is a very effective control technique, and I'm going to talk about that a little later. So I'm not going to go over any of that just yet. So there are a fair number of things available for control of cucumber beetles as far as insecticides go. And if you're a conventional grower, of course, there's a lot more that's available. So you can apply something like Admire at planting, and there are several pyrethroid insecticides available for foliar application, as well as 7 is quite effective as a foliar for foliar applications. There's really only one organic insecticide that's recommended for cucumber beetle control, and it's also in that pyrethroid class of insecticides. And so what this means is that there are only 2 different classes of insecticides that are really recommended for cucumber beetles, whether you're organic or conventional. And that information is important just when thinking about rotating for insect resistance management, because when it comes to things like controlling striped and spotted cucumber beetles, it's really hard to rotate chemistries for insecticide management because you basically have 2 choices if you're a conventional grower. And if you're an organic grower, you kind of have one. And so that's just something to keep in mind. You'll see throughout this presentation that I'll divide things by insecticide class and then give you trade names after that. And that's just to give you an idea of sort of the variety of chemistries that are out there. So the next pest up is the squash vine borer. And as the name suggests, the caterpillar lives in the vines. Now, I've included a photo of the adult here for you to take a look at. It's a really large, charismatic, very pretty moth that looks a little like a wasp. And if you're seeing those guys flying around, it's almost guaranteed that you either have squash vine borers in your vines or you're going to soon. And I always like to point out these pictures because I think with really big, charismatic, pretty insects, it can sometimes be hard to remember that they are devastating pests. So the squash vine borer overwinters as a pupa, and the moths actually don't emerge in northern Illinois till about July. They emerge much earlier in southern Illinois, but you would expect to see them in July and in northern Illinois. The moths then will lay their eggs at the base of the vines, and the larvae tunnel within the vines. And this will cause those vines to wilt. You want to begin scouting for this pest as soon as the vines begin to run. You're going to be looking for those moths and for entrance holes at the base of the vines. And this is from the larval tunneling. And you can treat when the first damage is noted and again about a week later. And by damage, I mean like those holes where it tunnels in, not once the plant, of course, is already wilted. And you can see too in this picture that if somehow the caterpillar isn't in the vine, the caterpillar can also do some damage, you can see in this lower right picture, to the fruit itself, although that is, of course, rare. The real danger for this is when it's inside the vines. So with the squash vine borer, the infested vines usually die beyond the point of attack. In other words, the vine dies past where the caterpillar is living in the vine. And this is a tricky pest because control of squash vine borers is really only achievable before the borers enter the stem. So you want to begin the scouting as soon as the vines begin to run, again, looking for those moths and the entrance holes. And a good way to scout for this is to use a pheromone trap, which are commercially available for squash vine borer. And the threshold for that is about 5 adults per trap per week to start treatment if you're using conventional production. In organic production, there isn't a specific threshold, but it really probably is 1 adult per trap per week because the products that are available for organic growers aren't as effective. So you're really going to want to treat immediately upon seeing even 1 adult. And in really small plots, one thing that you can do is you can mound the soil around the base of the vines to encourage advantageous root growth from portions of the vine beyond the point of vine borer damage. And this could actually salvage the plant for you. So as far as conventional squash vine borer control goes, there are a few things that are labeled. Again, here, we're only in 2 different classes, so there are quite a few pyrethroids that are available. In addition, you can use a sail But Athey is a neonicotinoid and it does have strong bee toxicity, so you really want to be aware of that. And this, again, to reiterate, once that caterpillar is into the vine, it's harder to control, but you can sometimes manually remove it. As far as organic control goes, there isn't a lot of efficacy data out there, but BT as a foliar sprayer and injection into the stem has been found to be pretty effective. And there really isn't a lot of efficacy data on either spinosad or entrust, but they're still kind of recommended for control of squash vine borer. One of the issues with spinosad is at the organic, the concentration you can put it on to be organic isn't quite as effective as the concentration that you can spray it if you are using it for conventional control. There are other things that people talk about for control of this pest, things like neem, kale and clay, thyme oil, but they seem to have no or limited efficacy. So really your options here for organic seem to be these three things for chemical control. So this next pest is probably the worst in Illinois for pumpkin growers especially. And I've included pictures here of all of the life stages. So on the left is another picture of the nymphs. And this is, and both of these are the nymphs. So the later instar nymphs, the older ones are up top, and the just hatched nymphs are down here at the bottom. They do change color over time. And this is where you want to focus your control efforts. The top right is the adult life stage, and it's the least susceptible to insecticides. And the eggs are at the bottom, and these can be manually removed. But if you're manually removing the eggs, you need to make sure you squish them too as you take them off the plant, if you're able to do that. But again, that's probably really only relevant for very small plantings. You're not going to do that in a commercial setting. So squash bugs overwinter as adults, and they move into cucurbit plantings in July in northern Illinois. There is one generation in northern Illinois. There's actually two in many years in southern Illinois, but in this area tend to get one generation. Adults lay their eggs in those small groups on leaves, and those eggs usually hatch in 7 to 10 days. And the immature stages, or the nymphs, go through 5 stages, and that usually takes about 5 to 6 weeks. The key to controlling squash bugs is to detect their presence early and act immediately. And squash bugs do damage to not only the fruit, but also the foliage. And the threshold for control is 1 egg mass per plant. And as I said, most insecticides are really not effective on adults, and they're not super effective on really large nymphs either. It's these little guys over here especially that you want to target. So there are several ways to control squash bugs. You can use cultural control methods. And so it's really important to destroy crop residue after harvest to help control this pest, and that gets rid of any overwintering bugs. As I said before, you can also destroy those eggs by hand, and you want to squish them when you remove them from the plant. Row covers are also a very good control option. And there are actually more modes of action insecticides labeled for squash bug than really any of the other pests that I've talked about so far. And so again, you have a bunch of pyrethroids that you can choose from. These neonicotinoids, as I will probably say every time I mention neonicotinoids, you got to be really careful with these around bees. You never want to spray when there's blooms. And then there's a couple other modes of action. Arvanta and Sevin are 2 other groups of insecticides. So you would be able to do some rotation to control, rotating of chemistries for control of squash bugs. There is one organic option that is listed for squash bug control, and that's Azera again. and that is also a pyrethroid. So I just wanted to sort of touch on aphids. Aphids aren't a main pest of cucurbits. Of course, they're a pest of lots and lots of things, but you can sometimes get outbreaks of aphids. And especially going forward, as I talk about the row covers that we used, it is not it's not abnormal to see outbreaks, especially under row covers. You'd have a lot less outbreak in open field conditions than you would in row covers for aphids. And with aphids, population growth can be really rapid because they're capable of reproduction without males, and the females give live birth to lots and lots of nymphs. And a lot of aphids don't lay any eggs, so their just generation time is just really, really fast. And, you know, aphids do damage to crops in several ways. The first is just the direct feeding on leaves that results in impact on plant growth. They also contaminate crops with honeydew, which is a sugar substance they produce after feeding. And this actually encourages the development of sooty mold, which you can see in the leaf on the bottom left, which can cause all kinds of issues as well. And of course, probably the biggest impact of aphids is that they transmit a lot of plant viruses. And aphid-borne virus diseases of vegetables can tempt growers to use insecticides to try to prevent these outbreaks. Most viruses of cucurbits are transmitted in a non-persistent manner by aphids that pass through the vegetable plantings. And they might make a feeding probe or two and then move on. So using insecticides to kill the aphids within the plantings does not always, or does not really prevent the introduction of viruses into fields, and rarely does much good in the control of viruses transmitted in this manner. You can avoid some of these viruses by planting early. And natural enemy conservation or release is recommended for control of aphids. So parasitoids, predators, can be conserved by not using broad spectrum insecticides, or you can purchase them for release. And the advice to use natural enemies would be the same that I would give for if you had a thrips infestation or whitefly infestations, or if you had a mite problem. And all four of these aphids, thrips, whiteflies, and mites are bigger issues in cucurbits if you're doing it under a row cover situation than they would be if you're growing cucurbits in open field conditions, generally. So I just wanted to go through a little bit just to give you an idea for aphid control. This is just a smattering of predators that are available for purchase that you can buy to control aphids for release. And they're across a variety of groups of insects. So up in the right corner, it's actually this little slug looking thing, this yellow thing right here is a fly larva that's specialized for aphid control. You can buy lady beetles, lacewing larvae. I would generally recommend things like lady beetles probably over the lacewing larvae, but there are lots of options available. And then in addition to that, for aphid control, you can also buy parasitoids. And these are small wasps that lay their egg inside an aphid, and then the aphid dies when the wasp emerges from it. And this picture on the right, you can see a parasitoid actually laying an egg in the aphid. And I just listed a couple of species here for aphid control, but there are quite a few that are commercially available. And I just wanted to point this out, if you have aphid issues, just to be on the lookout for these aphid mummies. So this is what an aphid looks like if it's been parasitized. So you can see on this leaf here in the big picture, you got all these bloated looking, kind of hard looking aphids. And that's an indication that you have parasitoids. And often you will just have parasitoids in your field. Pretty much if you have aphids, you'll probably have parasitoids. And this is good because this is showing you that you have some natural control of aphid issues you might be experiencing. So I kind of want to switch gears here. That was a really quick going through some of those main pests. And what I want to do is I want to talk about a project that I did while I was a grad student at the University of Kentucky. And the list here is some of the people who worked on this project with me or helped set up all these plots. And we were studying cultural control methods in cucurbit production. And really, the primary pests that we were looking at in the years that we did this study were cucumber beetles. And I'm not going to talk about squash bugs much from now on because for whatever reason, during this study, we really didn't have much squash bug in our fields at all, which was rare. We always had squash bugs, but for some reason while we were doing this study, we collected almost none. They didn't seem to be in our open plots at all. That all being said, I do think that this type of row cover would be very useful for squash bug exclusion as well. We just didn't have them. And so I'm going to go into detail about our use of these row covers and the things that we learned. So these were the primary pests, the spotted and striped cucumber beetles. And then the other pests in our system were aphids, thrips, and tarnished plant bugs. So I talked a little about aphids. We also saw some thrips in our plots, and then a few tarnished plant bugs as well. And these generally didn't cause too much issue, but we did keep track of them. And so I'm going to go into detail about this use of row covers. So cultural control is any practice that modifies the environment for pest control. And this could include modifying soil fertility or pH, modifying irrigation practices, changing light levels or temperature, or the use of ground cover for weed control, or the use of fabric row covers for insect exclusion. So in this project, what we did is we focused on the use of straw mulch ground cover, which you can kind of see in this picture in the foreground underneath the row covers, as our weed suppression control and for weed control. And then we used row covers. I'm not really going to talk too much about the mesh ground cover going forward. I will mention it a little, but I'm primarily going to be talking about the row covers. So fabric row covers have several advantages over open fields. You can use fewer insecticides because of the early season insect exclusion. They have been shown to result in higher yield, and they can reduce the incidence of bacterial wilt. And in this case, and in this picture under here, you'll see the traditionally used polypropylene spun bonded fabric cover, which is what growers, at least in Kentucky, had been using for quite a long time. Unfortunately, fabric row covers have several drawbacks. They increase the temperature underneath them, with the temperature under the row covers being substantially higher than ambient temperatures. We did insect sampling underneath the row covers, and we could not go in past, mid-morning because it got too hot to be in there as a human. And you really couldn't be under there for more than just a few minutes by the afternoon. And in extreme circumstances, and this did happen a few times, the plants could die early in the season under the row covers. And this will actually be really important later in this talk. The other thing is you have to frequently remove them for pollination. So obviously bees can't get underneath those. And so we had to remove them when at anthesis for pollination. And then we actually could not put them back on after pollination because it was too hot, it was too warm or hot in the middle of the summer to put those row covers back on for the plants. And so this prevented full season insect control. The other thing that's difficult about these is you can't see through these covers, and so it makes scouting really difficult. You actually have to get underneath it to scout and look for any insect issues or even disease issues that you might want to be looking for. The other thing is that they are not really durable and they tear easily, and they really can only be used for 1 year usually, especially in the big pieces that we were using. So what we wanted to do is we wanted to look at basically a different type of row cover. So I'm going to be calling these the mesh row covers, even though technically both of them are fabric, I suppose. These were made of a 60 gauge polyamide mesh. And they offer all the benefits of the fabric row covers, but with fewer of the costs, if you will. They are significantly cooler underneath. And as you can see from the picture here, you can actually see what's going on underneath them without going under them. You're able to assess your crops without removing the covers. They're permeable, so you can apply pesticides without removing them. And they can offer extended pest control, as they can be reapplied after pollination. The other thing is it's actually possible to add bumblebees underneath the row covers so they don't have to be removed at pollination, and you can achieve full season pest exclusion. In addition to that, this type of row cover is much more durable. They may be able to be reused for many years. And the experiment that I'm going to talk about was done in organic squash and muskmelon. Now, I should note here, and I think it's really important to say this, is that these row covers are more expensive than the old style fabric row covers. I want to say they were like 3 or 4 times more expensive. And so that's just something to keep in mind when looking at using these different cultural control practices. Although if we didn't, it did take a lot of work and a lot of time to move the row covers off and put them back on. So it is possible that keeping them on all season and then putting the bees underneath them would still in the end be more cost effective. So for this project, we used standard plasticulture, and we had plots that were with bare ground and plots with mulch row ground cover. And so you can see that in this picture. You can see the plots we were setting up back here with the straw mulch we were rolling out. And we kind of did this by hand. So again, it was really labor intensive, but of course, if you're laying out ground cover like this, you would be doing it probably in a more mechanized way than we did. So we laid the mulch out before we put together the plots, and we wanted to know if the ground cover itself also had any effect on pests or yield. We were not measuring weeds. We actually hand weeded these plots throughout the year because the weed pressure, especially in the bare ground plots, got really out of control really fast, which probably surprises no one because we were in an organic system. So of course we really couldn't spray any herbicides or anything. We used the standard water wheel planter. And then we actually added landscape fabric around all of the plots to try to deal with the weeds that might be outside of our plots. And then we used these hoops for the mesh row covers. You actually have to use quite a bit more substantial hoops than you do for the fabric ones because the mesh is heavier. So we actually had to buy larger conduit metal to do those row covers than just sort of these, the loop hoops, if you will, that were a lot flimsier, but kind of easier to work with. We actually had to bend this conduit ourselves to make these hoops. And so you can kind of see that here. You can see these, our plots made up here with the hoops. And you can see through them really nice. You know, you can imagine that scouting through these was much easier than with the fabric row covers. And the other thing we used is we used these rock bags to keep down the sides and prevent ground insect immigration. Although this is probably not the best system for that, because you can imagine that there's a little bit of permeability here. So we were probably getting a little bit of insects coming into these, coming into our plots anyway. But this is what we use. So these kind of plastic bags that were filled with rocks. We tried to just put dirt over the top of these, but even with the landscape fabric, you tended to get some encroachment of weeds through that anyway. We did put some of the dirt on the fabric plots, but yeah, we did get some weed encroachment here. And as you can see, can't really scout for anything underneath these, and they are much lower than the mesh row covers. And so this field experiment took place at the University of Kentucky Cell Farm Experiment Station. And we had 16, I'm just going to talk about the melon project. It's 16 plots of melon. And we did do some periodic organic pesticide treatment. And there were 4 treatments here. We had the 2 types of row cover, the fabric and the mesh, and the 2 types of ground cover, the mulch and bare ground. And then as you see on the bottom here, this timeline, this gives you another idea of what kind of control you would expect to get from the different types of row covers. So in the beginning of the season, all plots had their row covers on. And in the middle of the season, when we had to open everything up to let the bees in, both of the plots were open for that. And as the season after pollination, we could put those mesh row covers back on. So then we had more insect exclusion in those than we did in the plots that had previously been fabric row covers. And we collected insects weekly. And then we also measured yield. And so I'm going to actually break the 2 years up because there was a lot of differences between them. And so, as I mentioned previously, we were looking for squash bugs, but we didn't find any squash bugs in our plots through the course of this study. And so we may have had a low pressure year. The early season row covers could have prevented colonization. And by the time we removed the covers, we had prevented enough of the population that it was not a problem. We didn't measure that, so we can't say that for sure. So the pests here were striped and spotted cucumber beetles, tarnished plant bugs, aphids, and thrips. And the ground cover treatments themselves didn't have any effect on pest numbers. And so this is just looking at the row covers. And as you can see from this graph, the white bars here are the number of insects in those mesh row cover treatments. And so in every case, we had more pest pressure in the fabric row cover treatments than we did in the mesh row covers. Every single pest across the board. And year 2 looked very similar to this as far as the pest numbers go. So I'm just gonna, keep this same graph up. For yield, ground cover actually did matter. And so I am including it here. Our yield was significantly higher in those plots that had the mesh row covers and mulch ground cover. And this could have been due to a combination of some weed suppression and maybe the insect exclusion from those mesh row covers. And again, because we didn't really do any testing of the weeds or the weed pressure, and we did a lot of hand weeding. And so in those bare ground plots, we were in there traipsing around underneath the covers a lot in the bare ground plots weeding. And so especially with melon, it's also possible that what was going on here is just because the weed pressure was so high that part of the yield reduction was just us being in those plots, because you get those once those melons start vining out, it's difficult to avoid them when you're actually having to be, especially when you're on your hands and knees under a row cover. It can be really difficult to control the weed pressure that we were seeing. It was also ridiculously labor intensive, as I'm sure you know. And so year 2 was a really interesting year. So in year 2, we repeated the same experiment just like year 1, just exactly as we did it. But in addition to that, we added another treatment. So we were really interested in this question of, putting bees underneath the row covers. One thing that we never measured was the populations of squash bees that were already in our plots. Squash bees are a native bee that are specialists on cucurbits. And it's possible we would have had some of those when we put our plots together because they nest in the ground, but we did not actually test or measure for that. And so we felt like we needed to add bees. So we added this treatment and we used the mesh row covers only for this treatment. And we had both bare ground and mulch ground cover treatments. We could not put bees underneath the fabric because they would die in the heat. And so that was just not something that we could compare. And so in these plots, we never removed the covers at all to see if we could achieve this full season insect exclusion. And we also wanted to know if we were going to get higher yields from having the bees in there for the whole season. And so actually what we did is we took, so the way when you order these were bumblebees, and when you order the bumblebee colonies, we put a colony in underneath every row cover, and we left it in there for pretty much the whole season. And so the pollination services were available to the plants for also an extended amount of time. So with the melon yield for year 2, this is just the mesh row covers. And so this is looking at the different ground covers, bare ground in blue and mulch in white, and whether or not we added bees or not. And so in the no bees added treatment, of course, that would have been open for the 2 weeks that it was needed to be open for pollination. And as you can see, there wasn't a difference in the marketable number of melons between the plots that we opened at anthesis and the plots where we added bees. And the mulch ground cover, having the mulch ground cover had the greatest effect on the marketable number in this experiment. However, we did have a higher marketable weight of the melons when we added bees. The melons were largest in the plots with mulch and bees added. And this has actually been confirmed in other studies where bees are added, the fruit tends to be larger. So these were great results from year 2. And so we were really happy to see this. We had pretty good yield numbers for both year 1 and 2 with our mesh row covers. But I want to take you back to the one of the drawbacks of the traditional fabric row covers. And that's this: with sufficient heat early in the season, all of your plants can die. And this is actually exactly what happened to us in year 2. We were several weeks into the season, and we got to the field one morning and found that most of our melons had wilted and died from the heat underneath the fabric row covers. So you can see in the picture here, the plot in the foreground was under the fabric row covers, and pretty much all the plants are dead. Like you can see some here in the background by my cursor that are still doing okay. They're still there at least. But then if you look behind here at these mesh row covers, you can see all these big, healthy, happy plants, which is what these should look like. Obviously, most of these are dead. And so we decided we were really too far along into the year to go back, replant, get more things in the ground. And so we decided to continue with the experiment this way because it was a more real world thing of what might happen with these kind of this kind of control measure. And at least in Kentucky, this was a thing that could happen relatively often. I mean, it didn't happen super often, but it did happen to growers. And so this is another one. So this is around anthesis, and this is just to show you all the plots being open. And you can see here by my cursor is a bunch of the one of the plots that was under the mesh, and then of course right here in front again another one of this is a bare ground plot that had been under the fabric. And you can see that weed pressure too here in this picture versus the mulch ground cover, which again is not surprising. That's what you would expect from a bare ground plot. And so we did actually take the data for yield anyway in this experiment. And more again, as a way to really think about one of the main drawbacks of the fabric grow covers. And so this should surprise probably no one based on what those plots look like. But we did have a couple of marketable melons in that bare ground plot because some of those plants came back a little bit. But as far as in the mesh row covers, we sort of saw that same trend again, where we had a lot more marketable melons when we had those mulch ground covers. And one of the things that I was interested in, and I'm still kind of exploring on this, is just whether or not this mulch ground cover, in addition to being a weed control method, actually helps to bring in natural enemies, things like predators, things like spiders, that sort of thing. And whether or not that's another perk of using that type of ground cover. Now, we did find with the mulch that we were still getting quite a bit of weed encroachment. And I think a lot of that was because our mulch layer wasn't very deep. And for those of you who use mulch as a weed control, like a straw, hay, I'm sure you know getting it to a depth that actually prevents weeds can be kind of difficult as well. And so the implications for this was that we saw increased melon yield with the mesh row covers across all of the different experiments that we tried. And we did get decreased pest pressure every time. And that's not surprising because you're excluding the pests, and especially with the fabric grow covers, as I mentioned, you end up with those open for so long that you expect some pest encroachment. And we were also able to achieve the full season control with the bees. And I think the ability to scout and spray insecticides through the mesh makes this a useful tool for both conventional and organic growers. Because there's no reason if you are a conventional grower that you cannot just spray everything you were going to spray anyway through the mesh if you're using the mesh row covers, whereas you really, cannot do that with the fabric grow covers. And then now, instead of breaking it up in between, I will take any questions you have or anything else you want to hear about. I'll try to answer anything. And this is all my contact information here. And so, yeah, thank you for your attention.
Thank you, Dr. Athey. As of right now, we don't have any questions in the chat, but I will enable participants to unmute themselves and start their video if you'd like a little bit more interaction here to ask questions for both of our specialists.
Sure.
So let's start with.
Let's just stop my share here. And I can start my video too if anybody has any.
That's great.
I'm back here too. Looks like it has been quiet session today.
Yeah, that's all right. I am hoping that obviously as the summers go on that I'll, next summer, the summer after that, I'll have some more like actual stuff from Illinois when I start, talking to everybody and doing more of that as well. I know that giving a presentation on stuff from Kentucky isn't entirely relevant, although a lot of the control techniques are somewhat the same, or can be.
Yes, I found that your graduate research trials, they were definitely, it's good to have those examples and photos to really compare and contrast different management, for sure. Again, if anybody has any questions, feel free to either add your questions in the chat box, or you may unmute yourself and ask them directly to the specialist. It looks like we did get one question that's off the subject of cucurbits, but could we see reduced corn earworm pressure this summer because of the cold weather in Texas?
That's a good question. You know, I don't know. I don't know. You know, we get corn earworm probably encroachment from a lot of different places. I don't know if the cold snap at this point would be enough to kill enough of them that they won't be doing their migration up here. That's a good question. I don't know. I would probably still expect to see the corn earworm at a level that's probably more normal, even though with the cold snap, but it's a good question. Let me see, I think I have something.
Dr. Athey, you mentioned last week about stink bugs on apples and some of the other fruit.
Mm-hmm.
Are there any different recommendations for, potentially, other vegetables? I know we've seen it sometimes on tomatoes and peppers, but just didn't know if there were different recommendations at this time that we might do.
So a lot of the recommendations for stink bugs are kind of the same for most of the crops they're on, aside from the fact that, you get certain insecticides that are only labeled for a certain crop. But for the most part, control of stink bugs right now, because there's only a few insecticides that are really effective on them that we have labeled right now, and so they tend to be about the same recommendations. Now I will say that if we ever get that parasitoid in Illinois, then we might be able to play around with that, because there's a egg parasitoid, but it's not, it attacks other stink bugs too, so we can't move it around. It has to end up here. Researchers tried to get approval to move it around, but it attacks basically all of our native stink bugs too, including the one beneficial stink bug that we have, the spine soldier bug, the predatory one. And so when that shows up, that would be, if it gets established, usually exerts some pretty good control on stink bugs. But right now, insecticides seem to be about all we have, and they're kind of not great at best. But as I said, I think it was in maybe it was in the sweet corn. The trap and kill for stink bugs is probably going to be the way to go. Where you bring them in with a lure, and then you permeate some fabric. They have different trap designs that are permeated with often a pyrethroid insecticide, and then the stink bug lands on that, and then it's enough contact insecticide that it dies. Because the key to bringing anything in with a lure is to make sure it dies when it gets there. Because otherwise you've just brought in more stink bugs, which would be bad.
Right.
I just saw another question on mealybug control on flowers in greenhouses or high tunnels. I would say mealybugs are your control options are kind of the same as a lot of those other things like scales and that kind of stuff, or not scales, but aphids and the other greenhouse pests, where I believe there are specialized natural enemies you can buy for mealybugs. And I'd have to look mealybugs on flowers. I'd have to look that up, but I'm gonna guess there's some biocontrol agents that do pretty well on mealybugs, because a lot of those like more sedentary, weird true bug guys, often the natural enemies do better on those than some of our other pests. But let me look up mealybug control, because I don't actually know anything about mealybugs, as it turns out, other than what group they're in. Yeah, and since corn earworms back to the corn earworm, sorry, overwinter as pupae, that's a pretty protected way to overwinter. And so you're gonna have less of the cold snap having an effect on them probably than other things, potentially. Maybe.
Any other questions out there? Or questions our specialists want to ask the audience even to gather any type of insight?
Yeah, I mean, I'd love to know, aside from the pests that I talked about in cucurbits, are you seeing other insects in cucurbits at all? Or are there any other things causing issues? I know leaf hoppers sometimes come up. I don't know if that's a problem here at all. Yeah, so I'd actually be interested in, aside from the questions, which were great, because that's other things people are interested in, but with cucurbits, is there anything else that you guys are seeing? Or the other thing I'd be curious about too, if anybody wants to mention it, is how many of the growers, if you want to use the reaction hand raise, are organic? I'd like to get kind of an idea about, what our number of organic versus conventional growers are. If anybody'd like to do that.
I'm seeing two.
Yep, me too.
But for those of you who may not be familiar with the reactions function, if you look down on the bottom right of your screen, right to the left of leave, you should be able to see reactions there, and you can raise your hand. Or put up any emoji you'd like. Thank you.
Yeah, and I see we try to be organic. Yeah, it is difficult, and it's difficult too, or at least I feel like it is, every time I start reading up on the organic control options that are available for basically whatever insect you might be interested in. I'm actually looking at studies, and so many of them are, well, this thing is labeled, but it doesn't have efficacy. Or one thing that I learned last week is that there were a bunch of things for stink bug on tomatoes that are organic options that work well in the lab. If you just spray them on stink bugs, they do kill stink bugs. But once you try to spray them on the plants, they don't do anything anymore. Like once you get them outside and use them where you would use them, they're no longer effective, which is unfortunate.
I would like to just go ahead and share a slide to just once again thank our sponsors and remind everyone that tomorrow is our final session of the Stateline Fruit and Vegetable Growers Conference. It'll take place at the noon hour from noon to 1 o'clock. And Extension educator Nathan Johanning will be talking and presenting on variety selection and weed management in pumpkin production. So definitely don't want to miss that. And we just want to again recognize our sponsors, Rep Seeds, Syngenta, and the Center for Agrarian Learning at MCC for their continued support, even in this virtual environment this year. So you can stay on if you'd like to ask more questions. We certainly still welcome those. But those of you that need to pop off, you're welcome to hop off. And we hope that you will join us tomorrow and next year. Hopefully we can have it in person again next year.
That'd be lovely. Yeah, and I did see one more a note of aphids getting ahead of people in dry conditions in watermelons and then spraying, actually increasing their population, which is, yeah, I mean, I think that's one of the bigger issues with things like aphids is that the broad spectrums just seem to kill off anything that was trying to keep them in check. And open field conditions are harder for releasing beneficials. because, you know, if you release lady beetles into your watermelon patch, maybe they'll stay or maybe they'll fly away. And so yeah, that using broad spectrums for things like aphids and stuff tends to, yeah, just kind of exacerbate the problem, unfortunately.
I don't know if you could see my screen now with the slide. I
Yes.
didn't have it up before. Sorry about that. All right, any other questions, folks? Ooh. If none, again, thank you all once again, and to our speakers, Dr. Babadous and Kacie Athey, for joining us